couple of reminders for the audience. Please don't speak too loudly. Put your phones on silent. You should know the drill. So all the relevant information is up on the screen. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start the speech. Thank you.
Our stance today is extremely simple. As a affirmative, we don't want these restrictions in place, otherwise we believe that half of NTU debates will not be able to get a job whatsoever. But more simply, we actually believe that these restrictions are artificial means of soothing unwarranted emotive anxiety. And this anxiety is something that does no good for economic prospects of the entire country and locals eventually. Firstly, a quick definition. We realize that in terms of quotas, we're looking at things like quotas in companies, like a max cap on how many people you can hire who are not from your country itself, or a ratio, for instance, maybe only one foreigner to every 3 locals or something like that. Also things like entry restrictions to your countries, in terms of how you issue things like work visas, or number of green cards you're able to give out. We don't want any of that. What do we want instead? We realize that of course we're going to allow you to come in as long as you can get a job. But more importantly, firstly, our policy aims to keep locals still employable, so we will not shortchange our locals. We will still have things like a good education system to make sure they come out with good certification and working skills. We will offer things as usual like skills upgrading, career consultation, state planning with regards to things like making sure education is relevant to the skills you need to survive in the workforce, things like moderating wage expectations, things like helping older people still stay relevant in the workplace, and also things like helping unemployed people to find jobs. Second part of our policy, we will still encourage interactional assimilation between people who come in and work from overseas and locals. We will do things that create chances and channels for discussion and understanding between locals and foreign workers and talents. No, thank you. We will therefore do things like education campaigns, helping expats and families to get to the local community. Basically, to humanize them in the eyes of the local community. Now that's out of the way, I have 3 points for you today. Firstly, I want to look at where government duty lies with regards to employability of local people. Secondly, on the necessity of foreigners coming in. And thirdly, on how this ensures the larger economic good for the country. So first of all, let's look at where government duty lies. And we believe that other side is going to come out and tell us, that the government duty is to protect the locals and to make sure they are employable and have jobs. We fully agree. But here is a nuance we want to put in, We don't think that government duty for this means that they have to go and reserve jobs especially for you. But rather, to make sure that you as a citizen are not shortchanged, that you are enabled to find opportunities and be able to qualify for them should you want them. No, thank you, sir. Why do we say so? Because we believe that keeping things meritocratic, keeping things such as, because you're a local, you take jobs for granted, is the worst way to make sure your locals are able to keep out and fight and stay skilled in the long run. But secondly, we realize, that if foreigners can come in and get jobs that are qualified, the reverse is true of our locals as well. What we are doing really is to make sure our locals in developed countries are very much made able to seek work elsewhere. And they are, especially in developed countries. We find that we breed some of the most mobile, most talented citizens. They are advantaged in many different ways. They realize that their first language will be English, or something that is very much usable in many countries around the world. So we also realize that educational level is something that is very much prized. They come from more reputable schools. They come with degrees that are highly certified. They have stable education systems. And they come with a great deal of social cultural capital. They are used to the right systems of operation, the right level of technology, the right exposure to things like industrialization and urbanization. And equipping them with these abilities is far better than just reserving jobs for you. Simply because that is what the global economy at the moment most prizes from you. And in the wider world, there are more diverse opportunities and experiences that can be dreamt of in a single country. We think it's great to open your access to it as a citizen. Before I go on, yes.
The average American still can't get a job in a place like Brazil because there are always going to be more Brazilians who will work harder and will take a lower wage at the same level of education.
Well, then we think it's time, for Americans to moderate their wage expectations and maybe to work a little harder. But it is odd for you that you're assuming straight away that your Americans are caught in a situation where they can never get any opportunities whatsoever. And that brings me on to my second point, on the necessity of foreign workers. I think it's very pernicious, like he has, to assume that in a country, in a developed country, nobody is going to want to hire your locals. I'm going to put it to you, the locals still maintain a natural advantage from the start that cannot be learned and cannot be picked up by any foreign talent or worker. that comes in. Why? They know local things like local networks, social networks, on-the-ground knowledge that they were born and bred with. They are also less likely as employers to uproot their lives here and go to a different country should they seek a job in their own homeland. It's also easy for them to fit into local culture and local corporate culture due to the understanding of the same reference and the fact they were locally educated from young. Therefore, we do believe, right, locals are still very much employable. The question therefore lies, where do we really need foreign workers then? Only to fill certain gaps that is highly desirable locals cannot fill. Obviously, it's things like your dirty, dangerous, demeaning jobs that low-skilled workers come into that you find citizens in developed countries not really wanting to. And we do need to bring in our foreign workers for that, right? Because they maintain the fundamental infrastructure and day-to-day run of the nation. But more importantly, we realize that often skilled foreign workers bring experience from outside the country. No, thank you. They bring in certain special language skills. They bring in things like specialized rare skills that we couldn't find within the country. Therefore, they are very much a necessary asset. And they're here, right, not to steal your jobs, but to complement the local workforce, and therefore build more future opportunities in industry for local workers. Furthermore, we realize, right, that when the economic needs of a developed country are greater, that the economics of a developed country are greater and more diverse than you think. Economic trends are always changing, and when that happens, we gain a first mover's advantage when we bring in talented foreign workers to pave the way and build up new important industries, and therefore pave our way new trends, creating more opportunities for local workers in the long run. That brings me on to my very last point on how this leads to the larger economic good. Well, yes, we do agree, we do believe that locals are more preferred usually, but in some small areas they are preferred over other workers because of local costs, say mid-tier service industries, or express who don't come with attachments and obligations and therefore can devote more time to your work. But that's how competition works, right? I think that locals bring more things to the table, but sometimes foreigners have their own selling points. Individual firms should get to decide which comparative advantage they need more in the workplace as they do in choosing any other candidate for a job. I think that's truly what makes firms competitive. European nations should have to hobble corporations for their own protection of locals. Because a competitive firm is so much better for a country's growth, so much better for things like attracting investments, leading to a better state economy, which then benefits your locals in the long run. We also think it makes locals far more competitive because now they have to stay ahead in terms of international workforce and international competitors. We therefore believe that when you set these restrictions and prevent those assets from coming in, you lose all these economic benefits that are so necessary for a developed nation to survive in the global economy. For all of these, therefore, we best boost competitiveness, we best help the locals in the long run. I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank you. To start the case for the off, I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition.
Let's recognize that generally we agree that on both sides of the house, if local workers can get employed, then we are fine with that. And therefore, a lot of the advantages that we talked about the advantages local workers have in being employable, apply on both sides of the house. So where does this debate take place? This debate takes place in the situations whereby local workers cannot get employed, and when we restrict foreigners from taking these jobs, local workers will get employed. And that's the scope of the debate in this motion. Right? So one point of contention in today's debate, the entire analysis of how governments help workers, so on and so forth, we think that this is not mutually exclusive. On both sides of the house, governments have an incentive to help local workers be more employable. But what is the difference in the two sides of the house? On proposition side, they are not going to give companies an incentive to help local workers when they can get foreign workers at a cheaper wage. On the other hand, on our side, when we restrict policies for foreigners, what this does is it creates a natural incentive for companies to better their local workforce, to give them better skills, to make them more suited to these companies because they recognize that this is the reality of the workplace under our side of the world. And let's also recognize that when you help local workers, it's more sustainable because these local workers are the workers, even if they shift job, they are more likely than not going to shift countries. They are going to want to stay close to their home. They want to work close to their homes. And for all these reasons, we think that on our side, companies have an incentive to help local workers. Moving on to my positive material. I have 2 points of substantive. Firstly, on how this better discharges the governmental mandate and directly tackles their principle. And secondly, on how it reduces xenophobia and tackles the idea that we artificially soothe anxiety. First point of contention, on how this better discharges the governmental mandate. I think it's not contentious and recognize that the government's first duty is owed to its own citizens because citizens are the ones who are voting for these governments. Hold on a moment, and vote these people into power, and therefore governments inherit the mandate of the people who enact these policies. But before I go on, yes, ma'am.
Why do companies choose not to hire locals?
We suggest, as I've already told you, that companies in status quo can get foreign workers at cheaper wages. But we don't think that, like I'm going to explain to you now, why this isn't good for your own citizens. Moving back to my substantive, right? Like we think even in non-democratic nations, there's an implicit social contract in which governments owe certain duties to their own people and to its own citizens. And like we recognize that the bulk of this debate lies in the value judgment of the cost-benefit analysis. No thank you, madam, of these policies. And on our side, we're going to be showing you why these policies are beneficial because it allows the government to better discharge the mandate to its people, which is what governments should be about in the first place. Now, why is this the case? Well, we recognize that in status quo, unemployment exists not only in the developing world, Mr. Speaker, but also in the developed nation, right? Like recovery in the USA stems largely from things like people leaving the workforce because they've been unemployed for over 99 weeks and don't think they'll get a job, like skilled labor doing unskilled labor, like skilled labor doing unskilled jobs. Like these are reasons why the employment seems to be up, but actually we tell you that this is problematic because like we recognize that countries by and large want to increase the potential of their workforce, which means putting skilled labor in properly skilled jobs, in encouraging like people to not leave the labor force but to continue being gainfully employed. No thank you, madam, in their own countries, right? And how do we directly address this? In my rebuttal, I already told you that we encourage companies to create foundations for employment, structures that systemically enable our labor, train our labor, better our labor. Like, for example, like job retraining, like grassroots campaigns to reach out to people. So the problem is about unskilled local labor being unsuited to these jobs. We fix them. And let's recognize that this is particularly because like these policies don't apply just to unskilled labor, but to skilled labor. Like we have a lot of foreign expatriates into our own countries, and this policy applies to them as well. So, like for example, like what Huiyi talked about, NTU DCs people might not be able to find jobs in status quo because their skilled jobs are being taken by foreigners who want lower wages. No thank you, madam. So, no thank you. And the challenge is this. Even if proposition proves some generic economic benefit, they need to prove why this doesn't outweigh the massive, enormous harms accrued to local citizens, and they have to prove why governments should care more about other citizens and not to the enormous harms done to local citizens. Right? And they need to contest the metric of how it affects unemployed citizens in status quo. This is very important. No, thank you. Second substantive, on how it reduces xenophobia and how this tackles what we talk about soothing anxiety in status quo. And let's recognize that the context to reduce xenophobia depends largely on how well citizens receive certain messages. What am I talking about? I'm talking about how feelings and insecurities constitute the lens in which all interaction is filtered with foreigners. Right? When locals feel threatened by foreigners with regards to their jobs and their livelihoods and their economic security, they continue to interpret all future interactions with foreigners through the lens of these fears and insecurities. They continue to view the foreigners as the enemy, as the other. Right? And we think that on our side, in comparison, the knowledge that the government is protecting your employment opportunities, in turn, removes this festering, unhealthy competitiveness It makes local citizens feel more secure and removes this lens that creates the otherization of the foreigner. Because we demonstrate on side opposition that we better discharge the governmental mandate to its own people, it reduces xenophobia and toxic environment and status quo. It does more good to its own citizens. I'm very proud to oppose it.
Thank you for your speaker for his comments. Deputy Prime Minister, please.
Mr. Speaker, sir, a couple of questions in today's debate. Firstly, are these restrictions effective in incentivizing, as they claim, companies to hire locals? Secondly, is there principal government justification to do this policy to ensure full maximum employment? And I'll deal with xenophobia because my substantive especially points this out. When we discuss the fact that what this does, it simply vindicates xenophobic sentiments because now you put state policy behind those sentiments of racist and xenophobic individuals that we already see in status quo. Now, firstly, we think the biggest problem coming up from NO was that he basically completely ignored Huiyi's argument, right? All he simply said, and this is the reason why I asked my POI, the only justification they have for why companies hire foreigners is because they just simply are cheaper, ignoring the many other reasons that she provided. And we think it's particularly problematic. Why? Because it meant they misunderstand the reality of the situation, right? There are many other economic reasons why we hire foreigners, right? A lot of them, for instance, bring about certain skills, certain experience from coming from their home country. For instance, if I'm a big MNC that seeks, for instance, say I'm a big MNC that seeks to go into the Asian market and use Singapore as a headquarters, I want to inform, for instance, hire Vietnamese because they know the local markets there. There are interests involved. They never dealt with that. We think moreover, but they fundamentally, even if we were to buy this idea that foreigners are somehow cheaper, we think that is a wrong assumption in the first place. Why? Because the kind of foreigners that really are going to be competing with locals for jobs in developed economies are ones that are going to come with high skills often, right? Because we're not really talking about really skilled jobs, right? Something that we pointed out earlier, but there's already a gap in many developed countries, for instance, for things like construction work or domestic work, dirty, demeaning, dangerous jobs that foreigners, that locals do not want to do with their high levels of education and degrees. We think in those scenarios, given that the kinds of jobs that really are under competition, right, that supposedly locals are doing jobs over, our jobs already require high salaries. Why are foreigners sometimes more expensive in this regard and not necessarily cheaper, as Kenny claims? Because, for instance, increased costs, for instance, like relocation fees, right? When I have to pay, for instance, to ship all your goods over. Furthermore, I have to do certain things, like, for instance, if you aren't eligible to get public housing, like you are in Singapore, I have to fund for you to stay in private housing. I may require, for instance, the relocation of your entire family, to put your children through international school. We think expats are expensive, but we think the reason why corporations choose to do this is because they believe there's an economic incentive to do so. We think, therefore, on the converse, these sorts of policies, what we often then see, with the restriction of foreigners, then we then see often then companies deciding that it is not economically viable for them to come to Singapore because they can't, for instance, to these countries, because they can't get the skills requisite for them to be able to, for instance, move into the region. We think that's a bad thing in the long term. Because let's face it, the economy just isn't simply about one or few or even hundreds of locals' jobs. It's about, for instance, and we think there's an important multiplier effect that they're ignoring when MNCs and foreign direct investment comes into the country, right? The fact that even if you do bring in foreigners, those foreigners will still spend money. There's a multiplier effect when you do have, when you do have investment into MNCs coming in. Why is it significant? We think it stimulates the economy on a much more macro level than they've ever dealt with. But let's ignore this question at the end of the day. Then what they also said was, even if they feel that there may be gaps in the local population, bringing in companies allows us to increase the skills of locals, because now they'll get training on the job. Because now it is the corporations that now have a responsibility to ensure the skills of locals. We don't necessarily think they've ever proven that they have that responsibility, especially since earlier on they just said that it was the state's responsibility to ensure the employability and the employment of locals. Firstly, as we pointed out earlier, we think the state does not have a responsibility for the employment of workers, something that Huiyi brought up earlier, actually never done, except simply assert they did have some to ensure full employment. We think the state group has a responsibility to ensure the employability. We think there's a big distinction in that particular case. Why? Because we think that often locals make the decision that despite them being employable, they choose not to be employed in those particular jobs. We think that there's a distinction in this particular case that's important. We think given that they make their active choice sometimes to perhaps not leave the country to look for greener pastures, we think that's a problem. But we also think, furthermore, that skills are still available on our side anyway. With, for instance, if MNCs do come because they are attracted by the possibility of being able to get, for instance, cheaper or more skilled labour within Singapore, we think it will still probably hire locals because there are incentives to hire locals. If you're coming to Singapore, maybe you want somebody who is in touch with the local culture. We think therefore there are possibilities, for instance, for locals now to move overseas. So if I work in Nestle in Singapore, I, for instance, now can move to Switzerland. We think the converse is also then true. So locals themselves are empowered with MNCs being attracted to come into countries as well. Now let's deal with the idea of xenophobia. Because what they've come up with, and they've said that this policy deals with rising xenophobia by basically pandering to these populist sentiments, that people are already upset that they're losing jobs. So let's respond to that by giving in to that xenophobia. We don't necessarily think that's true. Why? Because as we proved earlier, the xenophobic sentiments that they're taking away my jobs is uncalled for. There is clear justification for MNCs for foreigners being able to take your jobs. We don't think it's just simply because, for instance, I, as the CEO of Shell, just simply have a preference for white faces. We think there is economic rationale that's perfectly legitimate. But furthermore, what we think in this particular situation is that when the state, the reason why these policies cause more harm than good is because they do vindicate the sort of xenophobia. Why? Because when the state makes certain policies, we assume the state, for instance, has expertise that we as locals, as civilians, do not necessarily have. They have knowledge about, for instance, how business works, because they are supposedly the experts and they can plan for the direction of the economy. They know, maybe because of focus groups and so forth, how businesses function and why they choose foreigners over locals. When this is created, when these policies are put in place, two particular narratives are vindicated. Firstly, that we draw lines between foreigners and locals in an even more institutionalized fashion. But furthermore, perhaps more perniciously, we continue the narrative that it is a zero-sum game between foreigners and locals. We think that's particularly bad. Given the possibility and given that the state adds weight and its voice of authority to this kind of discussion, where previously you may have had nebulous xenophobia, people just felt a vague sense of discontent, for instance, about a lot of foreign faces in the trade. Now what you say is they can point to the state and say, precisely, they are taking away our jobs, precisely they are undermining my quality of living. We think that's bad, we think it hurts them, we think that increases xenophobia, we are glad to propose.
Thank you very much. Viha, Loke.
There are two very big problems with Team Proposition's case. The first lies in unpacking the phrase. Many foreign workers are in trade. I'm sure most of us are familiar with this if you live in a place like Singapore. What does this mean? It means Proposition cannot get away with claiming the only foreigners empirically who are taking jobs in developed countries are the best, the brightest, with the most specific skills. This might be where the economic rationale is strongest, but companies don't follow the economic rationale of the economy as a whole. Empirically, in many developed countries, you do have foreign workers working in the service sector, like the Polish cashier at Paramount in the United Kingdom, or like the individual working from Mexico who's working as a server at McDonald's or a restaurant. So even if this debate is about that specific group, this policy of having absolutely no restrictions prevents our ability, like stops us from discriminating. In the areas where they're not economically beneficial, we have to let them in anyway. That's the premise of my first speaker's case, not just that. Second, key recognition. Think about their case for a moment. It's basically, most locals will be hired, We want most locals to work locally. We just want a small sliver, the tiny gap that Huiyi talks about, to be plugged by foreigners. How is this mutually exclusive with our policy? This is the status quo. The status quo acknowledges that the gap exists, we control the size of the gap, and we dictate who should belong in this gap by using restrictions to screen for the types of specific specialized skills that they want. Think about why when we give out visas to select individuals, because we acknowledge that they have the specific skills to do a specific job, hence we give them that job visa. So once again, that case sounds awfully similar to the status quo, and the status quo in many developed countries is the policy that we stand for. That's what my first speaker told you. In lieu of this, two rebuttals. First, when duty calls, what should we do? Number two, how we fight xenophobia. Last argument is going to be why this is better for the countries, like developing countries where lots of these individuals come from. When duty calls. Now, when does duty call? As I told you, there are specific situations where, despite the nuances that proposition has talked about, there are simply too many foreigners, and locals don't have the requisite skills at a certain point of time to get a job. At the very least, we don't shoot ourselves in the foot. Why does this happen? Think about it. It's not just a case that we are giving you the skills for employment and as they claim, we have no duty to give you a job. There's an active harm to opening up your country to many foreigners. Every foreigner that comes in with a green card or with a visa is a foreigner who you intend to take a job from a local citizen. There is a zero-sum game. So if you think on one side, the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore should be training local citizens, why on earth should the Ministry of Foreign Affairs be creating an even more liberal immigration policy that makes the job of the Ministry of Manpower that much harder? There's a tangible trade-off that is being made because it makes the policies of your side less effective. So at the very least, if you acknowledge there is a duty, one way by which we can make our people more employable and give them a basic standard of employment is to have some restrictions in the areas where they can currently perform these jobs. Second of all, no thank you, where is the mutual exclusivity lies in the notion of specialized skills. So the second speaker, they essentially made the case about these specific skills, like knowing the Chinese region, knowing the Asian region. These seem like pretty easy skills to justify, which means that as long as we have a smart, restrictive policy, which is what my first speaker told you about, it is incredibly easy for us to put these individuals within the band of restriction. Where's the difference? The difference is that we don't think companies should be the one to decide this on their own. Companies should not have the freedom to say, I think this skill is pretty unique, I don't think any of local citizens can perform this job. Because sometimes they can. The alternative to bringing in a Chinese citizen is to send one of your locals to work at a Chinese branch, no thank you, and enable him to pick up those same skills and culture. It might be more costly, but in terms of its social value, ensuring your duty to maintain employment outside is better. So the government and the state should be the one that decides where employment goes. And when we do need to screen, the state should be the one doing it, not the companies of a country doing this on their own free will. So the comparative is very simple. Our side promises more employment, we fulfill our duty better, we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, we create a more consistent economic policy. Second issue, the perception of xenophobia. Now here there is essentially a deadlock, because Rebecca says this vindicates people, because it makes them feel like, yeah, the racists are right, they are taking our jobs. But on the other hand, as we told you, what often happens is that not doing anything makes people give up in the government and feel like the government is leaving them at the mercy of people in general. So how do we break this deadlock? We posit that interaction can be a beneficial thing, but the interaction must happen in a good way. The good premise of interaction is in knowing that you are in control, that foreigners aren't coming into your country because they're forcing themselves upon you, that they're here because they were approved of, because they're bringing a value to the society. This provides you with a safety net and the confidence to interact with people in a way that is not malicious or suspicious. So control is important. I'll take you in a moment. This is how we break the deadlock. This policy of restrictions gives people the illusion of control, even if that's all it is. At its worst, it's still the illusion that the government is taking care of you, and as a result, this forces a more positive round of interactions to break xenophobia. Outside breaks this deadlock in this way. Go ahead.
If you want to know what Canada you can't decide, and governments don't have to run local jobs, then you abandon both economic and protectionist calculus. What's your calculus for this restriction then?
A calculus is very simple, right? There's some companies who are trying to bring in workers when locals can do these jobs. We would use restrictions so that companies can't bring in these foreigners. Companies might have legitimate grounds on which to bring workers in if they have unique specialized skills that are irreplaceable. In these situations, government restrictions, it's a restriction, it's not a complete ban on foreign workers. So restrictions can accommodate it, by allowing these specific skills individuals to come in, as long as they can justify their skill set to the government rather than at a company level in and of themselves independently, because they have absolutely no duty to their people. Okay, last argument. Why this makes things worse for the countries, the developing countries, the people of developing countries. Many people in developed countries, many university graduates in developed countries come from developing countries. often they're the ones that are poached immediately while coming out of university. This is a bad thing. Many times we have funded their education as a developed country with the implicit understanding we're doing this to help the developing world. So for instance, we explicitly say, if you're coming from a poor African country, let me offer you a scholarship because this is like spreading information and doing good things in the world. What happens on their side of the house? It just allows like lots of these individuals to be poached by big firms immediately after coming out of university. This kind of like breaks any understanding we once had, right? And I think with the comparative, they do far less good in developed countries, whereas they themselves say there are already many people with graduates at the high levels of education. With these restrictions, the vast majority of them would return to their home countries, where they'd still get pretty good, decent jobs, but more importantly, their university education, their expertise and their skills would be best put to use. They'll do far more good in developing countries, simply because marginally there are less of them there. So it makes sense from our perspective, as well as the perspective of developing countries, to encourage this to happen. That's part of what being a developed country and an information-based economy with a good education system is. That's how you pay your debt back to the world. Our side is better for employment, our side is better for xenophobia, our side is better for the world at large. I am so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. We'd like to invite the whip of the government.
Extremely confusing opposition who on one hand had a principle and then conceded it in the same speech and then re-fight the same principle again a few minutes later. We don't really know what opposition wants to go for. We're going to do two things in this speech. One, what is government mandate and what are duties of corporations when it comes to hiring or providing employment? Secondly, can locals compete under that paradigm and how does xenophobia and social constructs fit into that? So let's start with what is government mandate and in comparison what are duties of corporations. We told you that government mandate is twofold, and it's not just about, allowing individuals to have money on a daily basis. It's two things. One, to help locals be empowered and compete for themselves, i.e. give them specific training to make them worthy of their own choices, to be able to compete with these foreigners that constantly apparently are stealing their jobs, and to actually be worthy in the eyes of these companies to want to have those areas. Two, the development of the country's economy and industry, the development of corporations so that you can build more opportunities for your locals to have more jobs, because more companies want to come into your country and more job opportunities open when you allow for an industry to flourish, when you allow for opportunities to open up. We think government mandate needs to balance both of these things and cannot ever suggest that only one of these things is more important than the other. We do not think that states have the ability to decide for themselves that these particular industries or all particular industries have some sort of gap that they understand and that they are going to restrict. The case is different from oppositions. We think the state cannot have any ability to judge what this gap is and how to make smart restrictive policy. Why? Because companies are the only ones who know what their roadmap is. They know what their expansion is. They know how they intend to change themselves, how they intend to have new policies, how they intend to diversify. We think that industries develop based on entrepreneurial and innovative ideas that companies create for themselves and not based on what states decide. In fact, states should not decide the trajectory of industries and companies because you then don't allow for economies to develop in the same way. And we think that it's hugely important, especially in a country where you want a diversification of industries and you want a diversification of economies to allow for that kind of opportunities to create. So we think the government mandate should not be to decide what those
defeat. Companies hire these people because ultimately the cost of the next 10 years of their salary is going to be lower than a local.
Look, if you're going to bring in a foreigner into this country to take a job from a citizen that's already here, you have to give them the ability to survive in this context, right? So the standard of living or the cost of living is the same for that foreigner that comes here. So you have to give them the equal salary that you give to the local in order to survive. So no, it's not cheaper for the foreigner. Let's look at mobility in general, right? We think that when you're in this globalized world, our locals are mobile. They can go overseas. They can go find jobs in other areas. That's why you have an advantage, especially when you come from a developed economy, that you have the average citizen you are above the average citizen of a developing economy, right? Better education, healthcare, exposure to industrialization, urbanization, and a huge market of development in a lot of developing economies means that you have the upper hand in moving to a different country and finding equal jobs, meaning you're still competitive and you're still able to do it. I.e., the government mandate to ensure you're employable is the same. Nothing has changed. Lastly then, we think that xenophobia at the end of the day is problematic. Why? Because the interaction that's built on control in that way speech literally suggests that locals should or would only have discourse when foreigners are second class and choose to be different from me. We think that kind of control in discourse is problematic and detrimental to the kind of discourse that we want to build in society, because xenophobia discussions need to be held when people are equal and on the same platform, and we do that when they compete on an equal and level playing field.
Thank you. We now like to invite the whip of the opposition here.
Viha called our case confusing, so okay, simplify. Observation. There are many local-born citizens who are unemployed in their home countries. Hypothesis number 1. Locals don't want to be employed, implied by Rebecca. Unlikely, because we told you people generally like jobs. Even if they don't like the jobs available to them in a specific industry that are open, they would presumably like a job if it was available. So this hypothesis seems unlikely. Second hypothesis. Locals want jobs, but they are outcompeted by foreigners. If the foreigners weren't there, they would then have those jobs. So, if this hypothesis is true, then we suggest the more likely of the two hypotheses. Restricting the hiring of foreign workers would allow locals to be employed, and, crucially, restricting the hiring of foreign workers just enough to allow locals to be employed without causing further damage to our economy. So, given that the second hypothesis is more likely, let's ask, should we do this, and whether this has benefits to society? But before that, a couple of wash points. They said locals can get employed in the first speaker. They said foreigners are valuable, and in Viha because they fill a niche. Alright, so aside from the fact that this is factually untrue, like foreigners do compete in industries that are not niche, like construction, which isn't really niche, like in food and beverage, which isn't really niche. Aside from that, like if it was really true that foreigners are so terribly valuable and they only fill certain niches, it's very unlikely that there will be restrictions on the hiring of foreigners in these niche areas. Presumably, that's not where the debate takes place, because then there will be no added benefit to these restrictions. The best case they could possibly reply is, the reason why restriction exists even when it doesn't benefit anyone is because people are xenophobic. So okay, that depends on the point of xenophobia. We'll get that later. So what? Should we do this? Government duty. The idea coming from government, we don't have a duty to reserve a job for you, we just have a duty to ensure that you're not shortchanged for a job. Or as we phrase in Viha, we want to empower you to make choices. Okay, simply asserting the nuance does not make it true. We contest this nuance on the simple fact that, regardless of why you are unemployed, harms occur to you if you are unemployed, whether you are justly unemployed or not. There is no such thing as unjust unemployment to begin with. So, given that, as Kenny told you from the beginning, states owe a first duty to their own citizens, and given that massive harms accrue to their own citizens when they are unemployed, well, thank you, we suggest that regardless of why you are unemployed, there is a harm that the states are justified in protecting you against. So the nuance they suggest really makes no sense at all. You cannot simply assert a nuance without connecting it to any foundational principle. The other principle idea coming from Gov is that companies have rights. And again, we suggested all the way from the start, like, the rights of companies are probably subservient to the rights of individuals. Governments do make decisions that curtail the rights of some people if it means protecting people from direct harm. The rights of a company, as Kenny told you, to a bit more economic benefit is probably outweighed by the massive harms of unemployment that occur to a single individual. The harms of not having a home to live in, of not being able to care for your children. So, given that massive harms occur to individuals who are unemployed, and the first duty of the states, both sides agree, is to make sure that people don't get unemployed, we suggest that even if there were other methods to get people employed, this is a legitimate tool for government to use. But we transit down to the second point, is this actually good for societies? And the first question is, which side better helps locals achieve that level of employability? So we need to analyze two angles here. Number one, company side analysis. So we suggest that even if you manage to treat locals on your side with government methods to make them as employable as foreigners, companies are still more likely to choose foreigners than they are to choose locals. People use it first and second. Why? It's not just because they compete on the basis of wages, but because traditionally you've always hired foreigners. They're a reliable labor supply. You trust them more. There are stereotypes associated with which kind of people are good at doing what kind of job. And these stereotypes affect hiring practices. So you are systemically more likely to hire a foreigner than a local, even if they compete on the same playing field. So why is it outside changes this? Thank you. Because when we cut off the supply of foreigners, you have to employ local, unlike what the third speaker tried to tell you. So, because of this, we shift the incentives of companies to employ these individuals. Furthermore, we told you we need companies to be on board, because companies can provide this specialized training, which they are aware of, to individuals, that actually enables them to qualify for these jobs in the first place. Thank you. So on the comparative of which side helps both on one our side, but secondly, we are also going to suggest that employees are more likely on our side to want these jobs and actively seek them out. Because there is an overriding perception of that foreigners are the only ones who are ever hired, that you'll never make it in a job because you'll always be out-competed. We told you this all the way from first, but the insecurities that amount in an individual who wants to be hired. So by breaking the perception that only foreigners can enter these industries, we make it more likely people will go for these retraining programs in the first place and therefore achieve that level of employability. So on our side, we make it more likely that locals can be helped. This is a marginal benefit. But second, on xenophobia, this is a huge point that we make, because except this, like if government's going to tell us that the reason why restrictions exist, even when it does no economic good, is because of xenophobia, then that depends entirely on which side fixes xenophobia. So this is a super important point. Before I deal with it, yes.
If companies traditionally only find foreigners reliable to hire, why is the likely counterfactual that corporations will now hire locals instead of just going to another country where there are freer hiring policies?
Because some companies are small and medium enterprises that can't move overseas so easily. Like, not all companies are major MNCs that we're talking about. We are talking about a large portion of SMEs to move from the penny economy. So moving on. Like, xenophobia. So we both accept that xenophobia will happen to some extent on both sides of the house. And we accept that with all message standpoints and debates, the value of the message received depends on the lens through which the viewer receives this message. So which side creates a worse lens that creates more xenophobia? We told you they create a lens of insecurity, which changes the way locals interact with foreigners. They told us that we create state backing. Okay, so we're going to suggest the first lens is much more powerful than the second lens. And Kenny did tell you this in his speech, because the insecurities of risking losing your job play directly to you. They might hurt you as a person. It means that you feel personally threatened by this individual who is a foreigner. You feel personally threatened because you think your children might go hungry as a result of his taking your job. So the lens which they create is far more powerful than any state narrative which they might create in contrast, that we might create. Like, who honestly cares, right? Like, oh, so government set in this policy. I guess that means, like, since governments are gods, like, we must buy this narrative. But one narrative is just far more impactful and personally relevant. So on their side, we have the personally relevant narrative of the offensive foreigner who threatens to steal my job away. We break this by asserting that, one, foreigners can't steal a job, we curtail their ability to outcompete locals, and therefore we fight xenophobia better. They can't actually break this deadlock, so that's why we think the lens they create is far, far worse. Finally, on developing countries, they simply asserted and inferred that they don't care about harm to developing countries because this is a debate about government duties. Wrong. This is a debate about harm versus good. So, like, if we can prove that the net utility to the world is diminished by that policy, and we haven't taken it substantive, the logic was unrebutted because they hurt developing countries, then that is a net harm of their side of the house. So we have a net good by encouraging foreign workers to move home instead of allowing this massive brain drain problem to happen. So on all these counts, is it good for us to place restrictions? Yes, it is. We help locals, we fight xenophobia, and we allow developing countries to flourish. For all these reasons, we must oppose.
Thank you. To close the debate for the off bench, I'd like to invite the authorized speaker.
In a perfect world, if every company acted as was good for the greater economy, then perhaps team proposition's outcome would be real. As we've said again and again, this outcome is that only the specialized skills, only those who need to find employment in the developed world with those specific regional skills will make it through. Everyone else will be specially cut out by companies who will not hire them in the first place. The thing about running an argument as specific as this is that sometimes companies just don't get it that precisely right. And the status quo bears this out. A quick sweep through developed countries suggests that the people who are working in the developed economy who are foreigners but not from that country are not just those with specialized skills, are not just with skills that are irreplaceable. The vast majority of them still end up in mid to low-level jobs, or even then, some of them are eminently replaceable, even if they are skilled. And so the case of team opposition was always very simple. Rather than expanding this disparity between what we need and what we have, it's a better thing to close this gap by using restrictions in an intelligent, careful, and considered way. By the end of this debate, we're still not sure what this principal inconsistency they've accused us of is, but even if we're going to talk about it in reply, we suggest that economics is sometimes contradictory. Economics is not about holding true to any one principle, it's about creating moderation, and that's what our side stood for from the very beginning. What does our side stand for? Three main things. Number one, we stand for fulfillment of your duty as a government. That is not just trite in the sense of we will give you skills and you can make your way on your own. Many governments are actively trying to help their people in the developed world climb out of economic recession and desperation, because it's not enough to tell people, here you go, help yourself. Especially when your policies in terms of letting every single foreigner in, bear in mind, not just those you find desirable, but any single one who wants to come in can come and look for a job. This actively hurts each and every one of your citizens that is trying to compete in that job. It is a zero-sum game, and your actions on one branch of government do directly hurt the ability of another branch to execute that duty. So it's not enough to just say there is a nuance, hence there is a distinction. Our side doesn't believe that locals must go overseas to find a job. Our side doesn't believe that they have to scrape their way through and take low wages in order to find that same mid-level service job. We believe duties are about far more balanced middle ground. Sure, you don't have to reserve jobs for them and be like completely apartheid, but you must at least give them a reasonable shot of doing so. And this policy creates some reasonable modicum of middle ground. Next point we want you to notice in our case is that we recognize that companies will change their behavior outside of the house. When foreigners are no longer the easy option by virtue of their lower price and the fact that you can often offer them a lower wage because they don't have a family who have to pay for their housing, they live in temporary houses, etc., stuff we told you, when this option is denied to them, it means it makes far more sense to tap on your local talent pool. And that means the incentive to invest in this talent pool in the long run. In making sure that they have more permanent jobs and they have good company loyalty and so on and so forth. So our side is far better because we get companies to move away from the addiction of using foreigners where it's not needed. That's what our policy has been about. We think it will change companies' incentives far better. The third and final part of this debate is about xenophobia. And once again, we broke this deadlock from the start of this debate. At some point, right, the xenophobia argument is going to come to a tie, to a wash. Both sides of the house is going to claim that they change behavior. The most important thing sometimes is a symbolic act, the lens by which you view the other. Our side has argued that it's far more important to target this lens than to change the other itself. Because, as they argue, if foreigners can bring both benefits and harm, what we want is for our locals to see the power of those benefits without feeling intimidated by those harms. And the best way to do this is to create a position of security through a policy that ensures and promises your local citizens that you will not be thrown to the dogs in a haphazard and uncontrolled way. At the end of this debate, guys, team opposition is not anti-foreigner. Some of us want to study overseas, some of us intend to work overseas. What we are against is a haphazard and uncontrolled policy of allowing any single foreigner, regardless of whether what kind of job they'll find and how they'll turn your people, from entering the country. Our side isn't mutually exclusive, it's far more precise, it's far more targeted. We agree.
Thank you. To close the debate, Dr.
In true World School Singapore fashion, there are two worlds. The first world is that of our side, where we believe that our government operates on two key calculuses. Firstly, an economic calculus. Our government realizes that there's a whole plethora of reasons why a firm may hire a specific candidate. It depends on things like skills, what each firm may want at a specific point in time, how well someone may fit into the firm culture, or the cost of hiring this particular person. In other words, the firm needs to look at how it can value add to what this profit-seeking institution wants. We want to prove to you through this, right, that firms really know best, and every one of these criteria really matter. Therefore, that's why we told you that foreign workers come in for things like your low-skilled jobs that nobody wants, or because they have special skills to present to you, or to set up new pathways, new industries that will benefit your people in the long run. I.e., they complement what firms can get here in terms of manpower. It's a necessary complement. And the ones who told you that was never really dealt with. But we're telling you, yes, firms have needs and they know how to fill those needs best. That's why we tell you that our government's economic calculus is so much wiser. We let firms have a choice. We let firms do their thing because we realize that's what truly creates a competitive workforce, increases investment, and also creates a good economy, which is what any responsible government should look at. But the second calculus that our governments look at basically is the calculus of the local people's interest. In my case, I came out and told you, but the government's duty of care is not to preserve jobs for people who don't deserve it, but to enable that all locals are employable, making it accept not only locally, but internationally. A nuance that was completely ignored throughout the case, until Darion came out randomly with some new method. He came out and said, no, we have always hired foreigners. No, that's not very true, right? And we don't really see any real counter reasons to counter my extensive analysis and my characterization as to why locals are still desirable. He also came out and told you that locals don't apply now because they feel inferior and undesirable, which really makes no sense, right? Because then where do they go? Didn't you see at the very start of your speech that locals really want any jobs to begin with? So we don't understand all that really matter. But anyway, we realized that Becker also came out and told you that what they are doing is use the state voice to vindicate things like xenophobia, something we stop. We also came and told you in our policy that we keep our locals employable, and that's why we are the ones that truly fulfill the calculus of what our people need in terms of social harmony and also economic well-being. So what we'll tell you, right, is basically our government is the one that truly unites these two concerns and two necessary calculuses. We make sure our people can get jobs. We make sure our community stays together. It is not fraught by xenophobia. And lastly, we also make sure that where local individuals might not be able to get their first choice in jobs, is for the greater good of a stronger economy which benefits the whole country. Because what is the government for? If not to consider the big picture of what is best for the larger population. That brings me on then to their role. We realize that their role is the one that lets the two calculuses, the economic calculus and the people's interest, completely clash and destroy each other, creating a pandering calculus instead. Let's get two things they brought to us. They came out and talked about government mandate. Kenny came out first and said, you don't want to make people angry, just give them jobs. But we knew that overprotection is not the way to go, something they ignored. But they really came out and told you, there's no duty to give them jobs. Our concern is too much immigration hassle. Not only is that make no sense, it considers his first speaker's case. Lastly, he came out and told us a reverse brain drain, which now false negligence, right? That assumes that your workers in developing countries still have jobs at home and will not benefit their homeland from getting experience in firms in developed countries. But anyway, that makes no sense. Because the thing our government mandate then is for their own developed country in the long run. So basically, this entire mandate point fell apart by itself. But taking it at its best, right, we think what they are doing is to abandon the economic calculus of creating the best economy for people, and to abandon the calculus of people's interests, only caring about what makes them feel good, without regard of what helps their economy in the long run. Therefore, they came to us to prove harms versus good. We have, but we will go one step further. Under their pandemic calculus, there is only harm in place for the country. Therefore, we will lift the policy restrictions I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank all of the speakers for the please.